The dust swirled across the horizon as Violet Rawley clutched her swaddled infant closer to her chest, the stagecoach rumbling beneath them like thunder across the plains. Her heart pounded with each jolt of the wheels against the rugged terrain of Wyoming Territory, 1875. In just under an hour, she would be meeting the man she had agreed to marry through a series of exchanged letters, a stranger who believed he was getting a simple mail-order bride, not a woman with a 3-month-old baby tucked beneath her traveling cloak. "Next stop, Silver Pine," the driver called out, his voice carrying on the wind. Violet adjusted the blanket around her son, James, ensuring his tiny face remained hidden from view. The correspondence with Xavier Zeller had been her last desperate attempt at finding security after her parents had disowned her for bearing a child out of wedlock. The father of her baby, a traveling salesman who had promised her the world, had disappeared the moment she told him she was with child. "First time in Wyoming?" asked the elderly woman seated across from her. "Yes, madam," Violet replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her nerves. "Silver Pine's a decent enough town, small but growing. Good folks mostly." The woman peered at the bundle in Violet's arms, though some can be mighty judgmental about certain things. Violet's grip on her baby tightened. "I'm to be married," she said quickly. "My husband-to-be owns a ranch outside of town." The woman nodded. But her eyes held a knowing look that made Violet's stomach twist into knots. "The Zeller place. Good land. That boy's been alone too long." As the stagecoach pulled into town, Violet caught her first glimpse of Silver Pine. A single dirt road lined with wooden buildings, a general store, saloon, small church, and various other establishments that made up the heart of the frontier community. People moved about their daily business, unaware that their newest resident carried a secret that could destroy her future before it even began. The coach came to a halt, and passengers began to disembark. Violet waited, gathering her courage in the small carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world. When she finally stepped down onto the dusty street, she scanned the faces of those waiting, wondering which one was Xavier Zeller. "Miss Rawley?" She turned toward the deep voice, and her breath caught in her throat. A tall man with broad shoulders stood before her, his Stetson pulled low over his eyes. He removed the hat, revealing sun-streaked brown hair and piercing blue eyes that studied her with intensity. "Mr. Zeller?" she asked, trying to keep her baby still beneath her cloak. He nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to Silver Pine." Xavier Zeller was not what she had expected. His letters had been formal, even a bit stiff, but they had conveyed a gentle thoughtfulness that had given her hope. In person, he was imposing, weathered by the elements and hard work. His face was handsome, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble, but there was a guardedness in his eyes that made her nervous. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, adjusting her grip on the hidden bundle. He reached for her carpet bag. "Not much luggage. I travel light." His eyes dropped to her midsection, where her arm was wrapped protectively. "Are you unwell?" "Just tired from the journey," she lied, hating herself for starting their relationship with deception. "The ranch is about 5 miles out of town. My wagon's this way," he said, gesturing down the street. He took a step forward, then paused. "Unless you'd like to rest first? There's a hotel." "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "I would prefer to go to the ranch if that's all right." He studied her for a moment before nodding. "As you wish." They walked in uncomfortable silence, Violet acutely aware of every passing townsperson's curious glance. Silver Pine wasn't large, and news of Xavier Zeller's mail-order bride had clearly spread. She kept her head down, praying that James would remain asleep in quiet until they were safely away from prying eyes. Xavier's wagon was parked near the general store. He loaded her bag and then offered his hand to help her up onto the seat. Violet hesitated, knowing the moment she climbed up, she would have to adjust her hold on James, risking exposure. "Is something wrong?" Xavier asked, his brow furrowing. "No, She took a deep breath. "Could you turn around for a moment, please?" His eyes narrowed in confusion, but he complied, turning his back to her. Quickly, Violet shifted James to a more secure position, and climbed awkwardly onto the wagon seat, arranging her cloak to cover the baby once more. "You can turn back now," she said, her heart racing. Xavier turned, his expression puzzled, but he said nothing as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. With a click of his tongue, he set the horses in motion, and they began their journey out of town. The road stretched before them, winding through rolling plains dotted with sagebrush. In the distance, mountains loomed against the vast blue sky. Under different circumstances, Violet might have marveled at the wild beauty of her new home, but all she could think about was what would happen when Xavier discovered her secret. They had traveled about a mile in silence when James began to stir, making soft mewling sounds that grew progressively louder. Xavier turned his head sharply. "What was that?" Violet closed her eyes briefly, knowing the moment of truth had arrived sooner than she'd hoped. "Mr. Zeller, there's something I need to tell you." Before she could continue, James let out a full-throated cry. Xavier pulled the wagon to an abrupt halt, his knuckles white on the reins. "What's that sound?" he demanded, though the dawning realization was already visible in his eyes. With trembling hands, Violet pulled back her cloak to reveal her infant son, his face red as he wailed, tiny fists flailing in the air. Xavier stared at the baby in stunned silence. "His name is James," Violet said, her voice barely audible over her son's cries. "He's 3 months old." Xavier's face went through a series of emotions, shock, confusion, anger, before settling into something harder to read. "You didn't mention a child in your letters." "I know," Violet admitted, bouncing James gently to calm him. "I was afraid you wouldn't agree to marry me if you knew." "That wasn't your decision to make," he said, his voice tight. "I had no choice," she replied, her own anger flaring. "No one wants a woman with a child out of wedlock. My own parents threw me out. I wrote to 20 different men seeking a husband. You were the only one who replied." Xavier's jaw clenched as he stared out at the horizon. "The father? Gone. He disappeared the moment I told him I was with child." Xavier was silent for a long moment, the only sounds being the soft whickering of the horses and James's quieting cries as Violet rocked him. "I can't go back to Silverpine," she said quietly. "I have nowhere else to go. If you don't want us, at least let me stay until I can find work somewhere." Xavier turned to look at her then, really look at her. Taking in her pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, the desperate way she held her child, something in his expression softened. "I made a commitment when I agreed to marry you," he said finally. "I am not in the habit of breaking my word." Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. "But," he continued, "I won't start a marriage with lies between us. Is there anything else I should know?" Violet shook her head. "No, just James." Xavier nodded slowly. "Then we continue to the ranch. But the townspeople—" "They can't know," Violet said quickly. "Not yet. They'll assume the worst." "They will eventually find out." "I know, but if we're already married by then, if they see that you've accepted him—" She trailed off, not daring to hope for so much. Xavier was quiet again, thinking. Finally, he picked up the reins. "We'll figure something out. For now, let's get you both home before dark." As the wagon began moving again, Violet felt the first tentative flicker of hope. It wasn't acceptance, not quite, but it wasn't rejection either. The remainder of the journey passed in silence, save for the occasional soft sound from James. When they crested a gentle hill, Xavier pointed ahead. "There it is, Zeller Ranch." The property spread out before them, a modest but well-maintained main house, a large barn, corral, and several outbuildings. It wasn't grand, but it was substantial, speaking of years of hard work and care. "It's beautiful," Violet said honestly. Xavier's expression lightened slightly at her approval. "My father built it. I've added to it over the years." As they approached, a dog came bounding out to greet them, followed by an older man who emerged from the barn. "That's Hank," Xavier said. "He helps around the ranch, the only other person who lives here." The wagon pulled up to the house, and Xavier jumped down, coming around to help Violet. This time, She made no attempt to hide James as she carefully climbed down, mindful of her precious cargo. Hank approached, his weathered face splitting into a wide smile that quickly transformed into surprise when he spotted the baby in Violet's arms. "Well, I'll be," he said, looking from Violet to Xavier. "You didn't mention the lady was bringing a little one, boss." Xavier's jaw tightened. "I didn't know." An awkward silence fell, broken only when James cooed and reached a tiny hand toward Hank. The old ranch hand's face softened immediately. "Cute little feller," he said, extending a finger for James to grab. "What's his name?" "James," Violet answered, grateful for the man's unexpected kindness. Xavier cleared his throat. "Hank, Miss Rawley and her son will be staying in the main house. Can you bring her bag in while I show her around?" "Course, boss." Hank tipped his hat to Violet. "Welcome to Zeller Ranch, madam." As Hank retrieved her bag from the wagon, Xavier led Violet toward the house. It was a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch and large windows. Inside, the main room was surprisingly cozy, with a stone fireplace, wooden furniture, and shelves lined with books. "The previous owner's wife was fond of reading," Xavier explained, noticing her looking at the books. "I've kept them, though I don't have much time for reading myself." He showed her through the rest of the downstairs, a decent-sized kitchen, a small dining room, and his office. Then upstairs to 2 bedrooms and a small room that might have once been intended as a nursery but was currently used for storage. "This would be your room," he said, indicating the larger of the 2 bedrooms. It was simply furnished but clean, with a large bed, dresser, and a window overlooking the mountains. "It's lovely," Violet said, fighting back unexpected tears. After months of uncertainty and fear, the possibility of a safe home for her and James was overwhelming. Xavier stood awkwardly in the doorway. "I'll sleep in the other room until—" He trailed off, color rising in his cheeks. "Until we're married," Violet finished for him. "If that's still what you want," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "I understand if you need time to reconsider." Violet was surprised by his consideration. "I thought you might be the one reconsidering." "I meant what I said. I made a commitment." His gaze dropped to James, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms. "But this changes things. You should be sure." Before she could respond, Hank appeared with her carpet bag. "Here you are, madam. Boss, that fence in the north pasture needs looking at before dark." Xavier nodded. "I'll be right there." When Hank had gone, he turned back to Violet. "Rest. We can talk more at supper." After he left, Violet sank onto the edge of the bed, still cradling James. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Could this be our home?" For the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. That evening, Violet came downstairs to find Xavier in the kitchen, awkwardly attempting to prepare a meal. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening slightly at the sight of her with the baby. "I'm not much of a cook," he admitted. "Usually Hank handles it, but he's gone into town for supplies." "I can cook," Violet offered, stepping forward. "If you'll hold James?" Xavier hesitated, then carefully took the baby, holding him stiffly, clearly inexperienced. "Like this?" Violet adjusted his arms. "Support his head like that. Yes, perfect." As she took over the meal preparation, she glanced occasionally at Xavier, who was gradually relaxing with James. The baby seemed content in the cowboy's strong arms, gazing up at him with curious eyes. "He likes you," Violet observed as she worked. Xavier looked down at James with an unreadable expression. "He's calm for a baby." "Only when he's not hungry," Violet said with a small laugh. "You should hear him when his feeding is late." A hint of a smile touched Xavier's lips. "Sounds like Hank before breakfast." The unexpected joke broke some of the tension between them. By the time they sat down to eat the simple meal of beans, cornbread, and bacon that Violet had prepared, a tentative ease had developed. As they ate, Xavier explained more about the ranch, the cattle operation, the few hands he employed during busy seasons, the challenges and rewards of the work. Violet listened attentively, asking questions that showed her genuine interest. You know something about ranching? He asked, surprised by her knowledge. My uncle had a farm in Pennsylvania, she explained. Not cattle, but I understand the principles of animal husbandry. When James began to fuss, Violet excused herself to feed him in private. Upon her return, she found Xavier staring thoughtfully into the fire he'd built in the hearth. Mr. Zeller, she began. Xavier, he corrected. If we're to be married, you should use my given name. Xavier, she repeated, liking the sound of it. And I'm Violet, he nodded. Violet, we should discuss our situation. She took a seat across from him, James dozing in her arms. Yes, we should. The Reverend comes through town every third Sunday to hold services, Xavier said. He'll be here in 4 days. We could be married then, if that's what you still want. It is, Violet confirmed. But what about James? The townspeople. I've been thinking about that, Xavier interrupted. There's a simple solution, though it requires another deception. He frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. We could say he's my nephew, that my sister passed away and I've been raising him. Violet considered this. But eventually people will know the truth. By then you'll be established as my wife. It will be harder for them to cast judgment. He leaned forward, his expression serious. But I won't force you to lie if it troubles your conscience. The consideration he showed touched her deeply. You would do that for us? Claim James's family? It would make things easier for both of you, he said simply. Violet felt tears welling in her eyes. Why are you being so kind? Many men would have sent us away immediately. Xavier was quiet for a long moment. I know what it's like to be judged for circumstances beyond your control, he finally said. My mother was part Cherokee. In some places, that made us less than human in people's eyes. His jaw tightened at the memory. No child should bear the burden of others' prejudice. Violet saw him in a new light then, not just as the stoic rancher she'd first met, but as a man with his own painful experiences that had shaped a deep sense of justice. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded once, then stood. It's settled then. Until we're married, Hank and I will tell anyone who asks that you're my cousin. Come to help with the house after my sister's passing, bringing her son with you. He paused. After we're married, we can say we've decided to raise him as our own. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would give them time for Violet to establish herself in the community. Time for Xavier to fully accept the situation. Time for them to build whatever their relationship might become. I should warn you, Xavier added. Mrs. Prescott, the general store owner's wife, will likely be by tomorrow with the ladies' welcoming committee. They do this for every new arrival. Violet's stomach knotted with anxiety. So soon. Small towns, he said with a shrug. News travels fast. I'll make sure Hank knows our story before he returns. That night, as Violet lay in bed with James sleeping in a makeshift crib Xavier had hastily constructed from a wooden crate padded with blankets, she wondered about the man who was to be her husband. He was not the warm, affectionate partner she had sometimes dreamed of, but he had shown a kindness and integrity that were perhaps more valuable. Whether love could grow between them remained to be seen, but for the first time in months, she felt safe. True to Xavier's prediction, the following morning brought visitors. Violet had just finished feeding James when she heard the sound of wagon wheels approaching. Xavier, who had been out since dawn checking cattle, appeared at the door moments later. Mrs. Prescott and her committee are here, he said. Are you ready? Violet nodded, quickly adjusting her dress and checking James, who was contentedly gurgling in his crib. As ready as I'll ever be. Remember, you're my cousin Violet, here to help with the house after my sister's passing. James is her son, my nephew. I remember, she assured him, trying to calm her nerves. Xavier hesitated, then added, These women mean well, but they can be inquisitive. You don't have to answer everything they ask. With that warning, he went to greet the visitors. Moments later, Violet heard the front door open and female voices filled the house. Taking a deep breath, she picked up James and went downstairs to meet the women who would either become her friends or her judges in this new life. Mrs. Prescott was a formidable woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a smile that could either warm or warn, depending on her mood. With her were 3 other women of varying ages, all carrying baskets or parcels. "There she is!" Mrs. Prescott exclaimed when Violet entered the room. "Xavier's cousin we've been hearing about. And this must be the little one." Xavier made the introductions, and Violet did her best to appear natural and calm as she balanced James in one arm and shook hands with each woman. "Such a tragedy about your sister," Mrs. Prescott said, her voice lowering sympathetically. "Xavier told us just this morning when he came to arrange for some supplies to be delivered." Violet shot Xavier a grateful look. He had prepared the ground for their story. "Yes, it was very sudden," she said, the lie bitter on her tongue despite its necessity. "Well, you've come to the right place to raise this little angel," said another woman, Mrs. Thompson, reaching for James. "May I?" Reluctantly, Violet handed over her son, watching anxiously as he was passed among the cooing women. James, surprisingly, seemed to enjoy the attention, smiling and grabbing at fingers and bonnet strings. "We've brought some things to welcome you," Mrs. Prescott announced, gesturing to the baskets: preserves, fresh bread, some dried herbs for cooking. "And," she added with a significant look at James, "a few things for the little one that my children have outgrown." Violet was genuinely touched by the generosity. "It's very kind of you all." "It's what neighbors do," Mrs. Prescott said, matter-of-factly. "Now, Xavier tells us you two are to be married when Reverend Johnson comes through." The directness of the statement caught Violet off guard. "Yes, that's the plan." Mrs. Prescott nodded approvingly. "Good. A boy needs a father and mother, and this ranch needs a woman's touch." She looked around critically at the serviceable but sparse furnishings. "Has Xavier shown you around Silver Pine yet?" "Not yet," Violet admitted. "We only arrived yesterday." "Then you must come to town soon," Mrs. Thompson insisted. "Saturday would be perfect. We've a small market in the morning, and you could meet more of the townspeople." Xavier, who had been standing silently by the door, spoke up. "That might be a good idea. I have business at the bank anyway." And so it was arranged. The women stayed for nearly an hour, asking questions about Violet's life back east that she answered with carefully constructed half-truths, sharing local gossip, and offering advice about everything from the best way to preserve meat to which traveling peddlers could be trusted. When they finally departed, Violet collapsed onto a chair, emotionally exhausted. "You did well," Xavier said, his voice gentle. "They seem to accept our story." "For now," Violet replied, "but it won't last forever. Eventually, someone will question why James doesn't look like either of us." Xavier considered this. "By then, hopefully it won't matter. Once we're established as a family, people's interest will fade." The days leading up to Saturday passed in a blur of domestic activity. Violet threw herself into making the ranch house more comfortable, using her limited sewing skills to create new curtains from fabric she found in a trunk, organizing the kitchen to her liking, and learning the rhythms of ranch life. James thrived in the fresh air, growing more alert and strong each day. Xavier kept his distance, rising before dawn and often returning only for meals. But Violet noticed small gestures that revealed his growing acceptance of their situation. A rocking chair appeared on the porch one evening, salvaged from the storage room and repaired. Fresh milk from a neighbor's dairy cow was brought daily for James. Books on child rearing mysteriously migrated from the bookshelves to her bedside table. Hank, the ranch hand, proved to be an unexpected ally. The grizzled old cowboy took to James immediately, fashioning toys from bits of wood and telling the baby tall tales of his adventures on the frontier, as if the infant could understand every word. His easy acceptance helped bridge the awkwardness between Violet and Xavier. Saturday arrived clear and cool, a perfect early autumn day. Violet dressed with care in her best dress, a simple blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and prepared James for his first real outing to town. Xavier had hitched the wagon and was waiting on the porch when she emerged from the house. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression changed. "You look nice," he said, the compliment clearly unpracticed but sincere. "Thank you," Violet replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. The journey to town was considerably more comfortable than their first trip together. Xavier pointed out landmarks along the way, telling her about the history of the area and the neighboring ranches. Violet found herself genuinely interested, asking questions that drew him out of his usual reserve. When they reached Silverpine, the town was busier than it had been on her arrival. Saturday market day had drawn folks from outlying farms and ranches, and the main street bustled with activity. Stalls selling everything from fresh produce to handmade items lined one side of the street, while children played games in the dusty spaces between buildings. Xavier helped Violet down from the wagon, careful not to disturb James, who was sleeping peacefully in a sling Violet had fashioned. "I need to see the banker," Xavier said. "Will you be all right on your own for a while?" "Of course," Violet assured him, though her stomach fluttered with nerves at the prospect of facing the townspeople without him. "Mrs. Prescott's store is just there," he said, pointing. "She'll introduce you to anyone you don't already know." As Xavier walked toward the bank, Violet took a deep breath and made her way to the general store. Mrs. Prescott spotted her the moment she entered, abandoning a customer to hurry over. "Violet, dear. And little James, how wonderful that you came." She turned to the store at large. "Everyone, this is Xavier Zeller's cousin I was telling you about." What followed was a whirlwind of introductions. Violet met so many people she had no hope of remembering all their names, but she smiled and nodded and did her best to be friendly while maintaining the story she and Xavier had concocted. James, who had awakened, became the center of attention, passed from one set of arms to another as women cooed over him and men chucked him under the chin, declaring him a fine, sturdy boy. Violet watched anxiously, never letting him out of her sight, but had to admit that the people of Silverpine seemed genuinely welcoming. After exploring the market and purchasing a few small items, Violet found herself at a table outside the small cafe, enjoying a cup of tea with Mrs. Prescott and several other women. The conversation flowed around her talk of children, recipes, the coming winter, and, inevitably, gossip. "So you and Xavier are to be married tomorrow?" asked a woman named Margaret, whose husband ran the livery stable. Violet nodded. "Yes, when the Reverend comes." "It's rather sudden, isn't it?" another woman commented, her tone just shy of suspicious. "Not really," Mrs. Prescott interjected before Violet could respond. "They've known each other since childhood, after all, being cousins." "Second cousins," Violet clarified quickly, remembering her conversation with Xavier about the details of their story. "Our mothers were cousins." This seemed to satisfy the questioner, and the conversation moved on to speculation about whether the winter would be harsh and if the new schoolteacher would arrive before snow made travel difficult. As Violet listened, James began to fuss, ready for his feeding. She excused herself, asking Mrs. Prescott if there was a private place she could tend to him. "Of course, dear. Use my office in the back of the store. No one will disturb you there." Grateful, Violet made her way back to the general store and through to the small room Mrs. Prescott had indicated. It was cluttered but comfortable, with a desk piled high with ledgers and a cushioned chair by the window. Violet settled in, adjusting her dress to feed James, and sighed with relief at the momentary solitude. She was so focused on her son that she didn't immediately notice when the door opened. A gasp made her look up to find a young woman standing in the doorway, eyes wide with shock. "I'm so sorry," the woman exclaimed. "Mrs. Prescott said I could get some paper from her desk, but I didn't know anyone was in here." Violet hastily adjusted her clothing, her face burning with embarrassment. "It's all right. I was just feeding my nephew." The woman stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "Nephew?" she asked, her tone making it clear she didn't believe the claim. Violet felt a chill of fear. "Yes, my sister's son. I'm raising him now that she's gone." The woman approached slowly, her expression softening. "Your secret is safe with me," she said quietly. "I know what it's like to be judged unfairly." Violet stared at her, uncertain whether to maintain the lie or admit the truth. "I'm Lucy," the woman continued. "I work at the saloon." She said it matter-of-factly, but Violet understood the implication. In a small town like Silverpine, a woman who worked at the saloon would be subject to certain assumptions and prejudices. "I'm Violet. This is James." Lucy smiled at the baby. "He's beautiful. How old?" 3 months, Violet answered, deciding that this woman posed a little threat to her secret. "And you're marrying Xavier Zeller tomorrow." When Violet nodded, Lucy's smile widened. "You're lucky. He's one of the good ones. Never comes to the saloon looking for anything but a meal and maybe a game of cards. Treats all the girls with respect." The information warmed Violet unexpectedly. It matched her growing impression of Xavier as a man of integrity, despite his reserved nature. "Can I ask you something?" Lucy said, her voice lowering. "Is it true what they're saying, that you're really his cousin?" Violet hesitated, torn between maintaining the fiction and trusting this woman who seemed to understand her situation. Before she could decide, the door opened again, and Xavier himself stood in the doorway, his expression darkening when he saw Lucy. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice carrying a protective edge that surprised Violet. "Just fine," Lucy replied easily, stepping away from Violet. "I was getting some paper for a letter. Didn't mean to intrude." She smiled at Violet. "Welcome to Silverpine. If you ever need anything, I'm at the Silver Dollar most evenings." With that, she slipped past Xavier and out of the room. Xavier watched her go, then turned back to Violet, his brow furrowed. "What did she want?" he asked. "She accidentally came in while I was feeding James," Violet explained. "She was very kind." Xavier's frown deepened. "Lucy has a good heart, but she gossips. We should be careful around her." "I think she guessed the truth," Violet admitted. "About James being mine." Xavier ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Violet was beginning to recognize. "Did you confirm it?" "No, but I didn't deny it either." He sighed. "It's done then. We'll just have to hope she keeps it to herself." He glanced at James, who had finished feeding and was contentedly dozing. "Are you ready to go? I've finished my business at the bank." Violet nodded, adjusting her dress and gathering James. As they left the store, she noticed several people watching them with curious eyes. Whether it was simply interest in the newcomers or something more, she couldn't tell, but it made her anxious to return to the relative safety of the ranch. The ride back was quieter than the journey into town. Xavier seemed preoccupied, and Violet was lost in her own thoughts about their impending marriage and the complications of their situation. It wasn't until they were nearly home that Xavier broke the silence. "Tomorrow's the wedding," he said, stating the obvious. "Are you certain you want to go through with it?" The question startled Violet. "Yes, of course, unless you've changed your mind." Xavier shook his head. "No, I just wanted to be sure you weren't feeling pressured." "I'm grateful," Violet said honestly. "Most men wouldn't have been so understanding about James." Xavier was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what happens after we're married." Violet's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't allowed herself to think too deeply about the physical aspects of marriage that would eventually be expected. "Oh? I mean about James," Xavier clarified, a hint of color appearing on his cheeks. "If we're to raise him as our own, he should have my name." The suggestion touched Violet deeply. "You would do that? Legally adopt him?" "It makes sense," Xavier said pragmatically. "It would make our story more believable, and it would give him certain legal protections." Violet studied his profile, wondering if there was more to his offer than practical considerations. "What would we tell him when he's old enough to understand?" Xavier considered this. "The truth, I suppose. That I chose to be his father when his natural father wouldn't." The simple statement, delivered in Xavier's straightforward manner, brought tears to Violet's eyes. Whatever his other feelings might be, this man was offering her son the greatest gift possible: a name, a future, and a father who chose him. "Thank you," she whispered. Xavier nodded once, uncomfortable with her emotional response. "We'll speak to the Reverend about it tomorrow after the ceremony." That evening, after a quiet supper with Hank, Xavier surprised Violet by presenting her with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, taking it from him. "Open it," he said, his expression unreadable. Inside was a simple gold band, a wedding ring. Violet looked up at him in surprise. It was my mother's, Xavier explained. My father gave it to me before he died, said I should save it for my wife. He paused. If you'd rather have a new one, we can arrange it later, but for tomorrow. It's perfect, Violet interrupted, genuinely moved by the gesture. I would be honored to wear your mother's ring. Something shifted in Xavier's expression, a softening around his eyes, a slight relaxation of his usually tense jaw. Good. That's good. That night, as Violet prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the man who would be her husband tomorrow. Xavier Zeller was not what she had imagined when she'd agreed to become a mail-order bride, but there was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that was becoming increasingly appealing. Whether love would grow between them remained to be seen, but she was beginning to hope it might. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Violet woke early, a mixture of nervousness and excitement making sleep impossible. Today, she would become Mrs. Xavier Zeller, a name, a home, and security for her and James. She dressed with care in the one good dress she had brought with her, a cream-colored cotton with small blue flowers embroidered around the collar. It wasn't a proper wedding gown, but it was the best she had. She arranged her honey-blonde hair in a simple style, wishing for flowers to adorn it, but making do with a blue ribbon that matched the embroidery on her dress. James, sensing her excitement, was particularly cheerful that morning, cooing and smiling as she dressed him in his cleanest outfit. By the time she descended the stairs, the sound of wagons and horses announced the arrival of the townsfolk for the service. Xavier was waiting at the foot of the stairs, dressed in what was clearly his Sunday best, a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his usually unruly hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He stared at her as she descended, and for once, his expression was easy to read. Admiration. You look beautiful, he said simply. Thank you, Violet replied, a blush warming her cheeks. You look very handsome yourself. He offered his arm, and together they walked out to greet their guests and the Reverend, who had arrived the previous evening and stayed at the home of one of the townspeople. The ceremony was to take place in the ranch's main room, which had been transformed by the women of Silverpine. Wildflowers adorned every surface, chairs had been arranged in rows, and even a small altar of sorts had been set up near the fireplace. Most of the town had turned out for the event, curious to see the marriage of Xavier Zeller to his cousin. Violet recognized many faces from her visit to town the day before, including Mrs. Prescott, who took charge of James during the ceremony, and Lucy from the saloon, who stood at the back with a knowing smile. Reverend Johnson was a kind-faced man in his 60s who spoke with Violet and Xavier briefly before the ceremony, asking gentle questions about their relationship that they answered with their rehearsed story. If he had any doubts about their tale, he kept them to himself. As the ceremony began, Violet found herself genuinely moved by the solemnity of the occasion. Whatever the circumstances that had brought them together, the vows they were about to exchange were real and binding. Dearly beloved, the Reverend began, his voice carrying through the crowded room, we are gathered here today in the sight of God in this company to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The familiar words washed over Violet as she stood beside Xavier, their hands joined. She glanced up at him and found him watching her, his blue eyes intent. When it came time to exchange vows, his voice was steady and sure. I, Xavier, take thee, Violet, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I plight thee my troth. Violet repeated the vows, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. When Xavier slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, his touch was gentle, almost reverent. By the authority vested in me, the Reverend concluded, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride. Xavier hesitated, then leaned down and placed a soft, brief kiss on Violet's lips there first. Though chaste, the contact sent an unexpected warmth through her. Cheers and applause erupted from the assembled guests. James, startled by the noise, began to cry, and Mrs. Prescott quickly brought him to Violet. As she took her son in her arms, Xavier's hand came to rest lightly on her back, a small gesture of support and unity that didn't go unnoticed by the watching townspeople. What followed was a celebration unlike anything Violet had experienced before. The women of Silverpine had prepared a feast that was laid out on tables outside, and music was provided by a fiddler and a man with a harmonica. Children ran playing between the adults, dogs barked at the excitement, and the atmosphere was one of genuine joy. Throughout the afternoon, Xavier stayed close to Violet's side, his hand occasionally finding the small of her back or her elbow as he guided her through introductions and conversations. Though still reserved, he seemed more at ease than she had yet seen him, even smiling at some of the good-natured teasing from the other ranchers. As the celebration continued, Reverend Johnson approached them, his expression serious. "Mr. and Mrs. Zeller, might I have a word in private?" They exchanged a glance, both thinking the same thing. Had he seen through their deception? Nevertheless, they followed him into the house, where Xavier led them to his office for privacy. "I understand," the Reverend began without preamble, "that you wish to discuss the legal adoption of young James." Relief washed over Violet. "Yes, that's right," the Reverend nodded. "I've prepared the necessary documents. As a circuit preacher, I'm authorized to handle such matters in areas without regular legal services." He laid some papers on Xavier's desk. "These will make James legally your son, Mr. Zeller, with all the rights and privileges thereof." Xavier studied the papers. "And his name?" "Will be changed to James Zeller, if that's what you wish." Xavier looked at Violet, silently asking for her approval. She nodded, emotion making it difficult to speak. "That's what we want," Xavier confirmed. The Reverend watched them closely as they signed the documents. "You know," he said casually, "in my years of service, I've performed many marriages and overseen many adoptions. The circumstances are always different, but the intent is what matters." He fixed them with a knowing look. "Your intent to provide this child with a loving home is clear. That's what God sees, and that's what matters." His words made it clear that he suspected the truth, but had chosen to help them anyway. Violet felt a rush of gratitude toward this kind man. "Thank you, Reverend," she said sincerely. After the Reverend departed with a promise to file the adoption papers with the territorial authorities, Xavier and Violet rejoined their guests. The celebration continued until sunset, when the townspeople gradually began to depart, leaving behind gifts, well wishes, and the remnants of the feast. When the last wagon had disappeared down the road, Violet and Xavier stood on the porch, James sleeping soundly in Violet's arms after the exciting day. Hank had tactfully announced his intention to sleep in the bunkhouse to give the newlyweds privacy, leaving them truly alone for the first time. An awkward silence fell between them as they realized what typically followed a wedding night. Xavier cleared his throat. "I'll sleep in my old room tonight," he said. "You and James should have the main bedroom to yourselves." Violet was both relieved and oddly disappointed by his consideration. "Are you sure?" Xavier nodded. "We should take our time, get to know each other better first." His sensitivity touched her. This man, who had every right according to law and custom to expect a full marriage immediately, was giving her space and time to become comfortable with their arrangement. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for that, but for everything. For accepting James, for giving him your name, for protecting us both." Xavier's expression softened in the fading light. "You don't need to thank me. I made a commitment to you in those letters, and I've made an even deeper one today. I intend to honor both." In that moment, looking up at his earnest face, Violet felt the first stirrings of something beyond gratitude, a warmth, an attraction that suggested their marriage might someday be more than one of convenience. As if sensing her thoughts, Xavier hesitantly reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering briefly against her cheek. The touch was gentle, almost tentative, but it sent a flutter through Violet's chest. "Good night, Mrs. Zeller," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "Good night," she replied, watching as he turned and entered the house, leaving her with her sleeping son and a heart full of new possibilities. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as autumn deepened around the Zeller ranch. Xavier continued his work with the cattle, preparing for the coming winter, while Violet established her role as mistress of the house. To her surprise, she found she enjoyed the responsibilities planning meals, keeping the house in order, and learning from Hank about the particulars of ranch life. James thrived in his new home, growing stronger and more alert each day. But he began to recognize Xavier, greeting him with excited kicks and smiles when he returned from his work. Though still somewhat awkward with the baby, Xavier made efforts to spend time with him each evening, talking to him in the same serious tone he used with adults, which amused Violet to no end. Their own relationship developed slowly, cautiously. Xavier remained in the second bedroom, but their interactions grew increasingly comfortable. Meals were no longer silent affairs, but opportunities for conversation. Xavier began to share stories of his childhood on the ranch, of his Cherokee mother and her traditions, of his father's determination to build something lasting in this wild country. In turn, Violet told him about her life in Pennsylvania, her dreams of adventure that had led her to answer his advertisement, and eventually, hesitantly, the circumstances that had left her alone and pregnant. His name was Daniel, she explained one evening as they sat by the fire after James had been put to bed. He was a traveling salesman who stayed in our town for several weeks. He was charming, full of stories about cities I'd never seen. I was naive enough to believe he loved me. Xavier listened without judgment as she described her seduction and abandonment, her parents' anger and rejection, and her desperate decision to become a mail-order bride. "You were brave," he said when she had finished. "Many women would have given up." "I had James to think about," she replied simply. "I couldn't give up." Xavier was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "My mother faced similar prejudice when she married my father. Her family disowned her for marrying a white man. His family wanted nothing to do with her because of her Cherokee blood. They built this place together, made their own family when others rejected them." The parallel wasn't lost on Violet. Like his parents, they were creating something new out of difficult circumstances. As October gave way to November, their relationship took a subtle shift. It began with small touches, his hand lingering on hers when passing a dish at dinner, her fingers brushing his arm when they spoke, a brief embrace when good news came about the cattle prices. Each contact seemed to break down another barrier between them. Their first real kiss came unexpectedly, on a cold morning when frost coated the windows. Xavier had come in from checking the livestock, his face ruddy from the cold, to find Violet in the kitchen, baking bread with James contentedly watching from a basket lined with blankets. "It smells like heaven in here," Xavier said, removing his hat and coat. Violet smiled, pleased by his appreciation. "My mother's recipe. It should be ready by lunchtime." Xavier crossed to where she stood kneading dough, watching her work for a moment before saying, "You've made this house a home, Violet. I didn't realize how empty it was until you came." The sincerity in his voice made her look up, flour on her cheeks and hands. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition of the feelings that had been building steadily. Xavier reached out, gently brushing flour from her cheek. His hand lingered, and then, with a deliberate slowness that gave her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. Unlike their wedding kiss, this one was neither brief nor chaste. His lips were warm against hers, the contact sending a thrill through her body. When they finally separated, both were breathing faster, surprise and desire mingling in their expressions. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," Xavier admitted, his voice rough. I've been hoping you would, Violet confessed, her cheeks flushing with more than just the kitchen's warmth. That night, for the first time, Xavier joined Violet in the main bedroom, and their marriage became true in every sense. Their lovemaking was tender, considerate, a physical expression of the bond that had been forming between them. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, Xavier's arm around her waist and his breath warm against her hair, Violet realized that what had begun as an arrangement of necessity had become something far more precious. I love you, she whispered, testing the words that had been growing in her heart. Xavier's arm tightened around her. I love you too, he replied, his voice certain. Both of you. As winter settled over Wyoming territory, the Zeller Ranch became a haven of warmth and happiness. The townspeople of Silver Pine, who had initially been curious and perhaps a bit suspicious about the hasty marriage and the baby, gradually accepted the family as their own. If some, like Lucy from the saloon or Reverend Johnson, suspected the truth about James's parentage, they kept their knowledge to themselves. When the spring thaw came, bringing new calves to the ranch and fresh growth to the land, it brought another surprise as well. Violet was with child. Their joy at the news was boundless, shared first with James, who at 10 months old responded with happy babbles, and then with Hank, who whooped so loudly he startled the chickens. The town received the news with delight, particularly Mrs. Prescott, who immediately began organizing a quilting circle to prepare for the new arrival. Xavier, usually so reserved in public, couldn't contain his pride, accepting congratulations with an uncharacteristic grin that Violet found endearing. Their daughter Sarah was born on a warm October day in 1876, almost exactly a year after Violet and Xavier had wed. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's golden hair, a perfect blend of them both. James, now toddling and chattering, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help care for her in his clumsy, enthusiastic way. As Violet watched Xavier holding their daughter one evening, James leaning against his knee and demanding stories, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From desperation and fear to love and security, from hiding her baby in shame to proudly presenting her children to the world, it had been a transformation she could never have imagined when she'd first stepped off that stagecoach. What are you thinking about? Xavier asked, noticing her contemplative expression. How fortunate I am, she replied honestly. How close I came to never knowing this happiness. Xavier's eyes met hers, filled with the love that had grown between them. We built this together, he said, just like my parents built this ranch. Something good from difficult beginnings. As Sarah drifted to sleep in her father's arms, and James curled up beside him, already half asleep himself, Violet knew with certainty that their family, unconventional as its start might have been, was exactly as it should be. The lies they had told to protect James had long since given way to the greater truth of their love. In the years that followed, the Zeller Ranch prospered, as did the family that called it home. James grew into a strong, thoughtful young man who shared his father's love of the land and his mother's compassionate spirit. Sarah was joined by 2 brothers, and the house that had once seemed too large and empty for one man became filled with laughter, arguments, stories, and all the beautiful chaos of family life. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children and the sun setting over the land that had sustained them, Xavier took Violet's hand in his. Do you ever regret it? He asked, coming here as a mail-order bride taking such a risk? Violet leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. Not for a single moment, she replied. The greatest risk I ever took brought me the greatest happiness I've ever known. Xavier pressed a kiss to her temple, his touch as tender as it had been that first time in the kitchen so many years ago. Then I'll protect you both, he had promised when he discovered her secret, and he had kept that promise every day since, not just protecting, but loving, supporting, and building a life with her that was richer and more fulfilling than either of them could have imagined. As twilight deepened into night with the stars appearing one by one above their home, Violet knew that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the most desperate choices, and that love, when given the chance to grow, can transform even the most uncertain beginnings into the most perfect of endings.